I still remember the moment she said it. The light over the dining table was warm and golden, the kind that should have made everything feel gentle, but it didn't. Lydia's voice cut through the laughter, sharp and clean. "Get out." The music stopped. 40 people fell silent, their champagne glasses suspended midair. My father's face was unreadable, but then he nodded, slow and deliberate, as if confirming a truth he'd been holding onto for years. My mother's lips curled into a small, satisfied smile. It was the same expression she used to wear when Lydia hit the perfect piano note at recitals. I didn't say a word. No tears, no pleading. I just placed my wine glass on the table, straightened my coat, and walked toward the door. They thought I was leaving in defeat. But that night I wasn't walking away from them, I was walking toward myself. And by the next morning, I would sign the deed to a $20 million mountain mansion in Colorado, paid in full. The sound of my heels echoed against the marble floor as I crossed the hallway lined with portraits of Lydia. Her graduation, her engagement, the endless reminders that she was the chosen one. Guests shifted awkwardly, whispering to each other. Some avoided my eyes. Others gave me that pitying look people reserve for those they think will never recover. I didn't care. I was done performing gratitude for people who had never seen me. When the front door opened, the cold Austin air swept in. It smelled faintly of rain and jasmine, and it felt like freedom. Outside, the laughter resumed behind me. The music picked up again. I stood on the porch watching the lights shimmer through the windows, and for a second I thought of turning back just to tell them that someday they'd regret it. But no. Silence had always been my truest language. I walked down the driveway instead, my footsteps steady, my heart strangely calm. The night air pressed against my skin, and my reflection flickered across the hood of my car. I caught a glimpse of myself, eyes dry, mouth firm. I didn't look broken. I looked awake. When I started the engine, the headlights cut through the darkness, and the house behind me shrank until it was nothing but a cluster of distant lights on a hill. As I drove, the radio played softly, some old country song about home and heartbreak. The irony made me laugh. Home, I murmured. The word didn't belong to that house anymore. Maybe it never had. The road stretched ahead in a silver ribbon of moonlight. I rolled the window down, letting the wind tangle my hair, and felt a weight lift off my chest with every mile I put between me and them. At a red light, I caught my reflection again in the rearview mirror. My lipstick had faded, a faint smear of burgundy against pale lips. My eyes looked older than 32, but sharper. I thought of Lydia's perfect white dress, the pearls at her throat, the way she basked in attention like sunlight. I thought of the way my father had nodded, no hesitation, no surprise, just silent agreement. That gesture had cut deeper than any words. For a moment I let myself drift back to the little girl I once was, the one who used to wait by the staircase for a goodnight kiss that never came. Back then I used to believe silence meant strength. Now I knew it was survival. But tonight, it was victory. The memories pressed closer the farther I drove. Lydia's laughter echoing down the hallway when we were kids, my mother's soft hum while brushing her hair, never mine. My father's voice telling me to be reasonable whenever I asked for fairness. I had been the reasonable one all my life, the strong one, the one who could handle less because they said I could handle more. I stopped at a gas station just outside the city. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as I filled the tank. Inside, the clerk barely looked up when I bought a coffee and a small chocolate bar. "Rough night?" he asked absently. "Freeing," I said. He didn't understand, but that was fine. Some moments weren't meant for witnesses. Back in the car, I opened my phone. A new email notification blinked on the screen. Offer accepted. Wire transfer confirmed. I stared at the words, the corners of my mouth curling up. The deal I'd spent 6 months negotiating was complete. The property papers would be waiting in the morning. A mansion on a secluded ridge near Telluride, overlooking miles of untouched snow and pine. $20 million. Paid in full. No family name attached. Just mine. As the city lights disappeared behind me, I felt the first drops of rain hit the windshield. The rhythm was soft at first, then steadier. I remembered another night years ago when Lydia had locked me out of her room because I'd borrowed her sweater without asking. I'd stood in the hallway for hours until my mother found me and said, "Don't make a scene, Evelyn. Your sister's sensitive." I had nodded and gone to bed hungry. Even then, I learned that my pain was an inconvenience. Now, as rain streaked the glass, I realized something simple. I had stopped waiting for anyone to open a door for me. I'd built my own. The road climbed higher into the hills. The city faded, completely replaced by dark fields and occasional clusters of distant lights. I turned off the music and listened to the hum of the engine. Every sound, the tires on wet asphalt, the wipers sliding rhythmically, felt like punctuation in a story finally closing one chapter. When I reached the overlook outside town, I pulled over and stepped out. The air was colder up there, sharper. From the edge, I could see the faint outline of the skyline, the glow of a place I'd once called home. I took a deep breath. "That's enough," I whispered. The wind carried the words away like a promise. In the distance, thunder rolled low across the sky. I remembered how my mother used to say storms frightened Lydia. She would run into their bedroom crying, and my mother would cradle her until she fell asleep. I would stay in my room counting seconds between lightning and thunder, pretending I wasn't scared. But I was, only no one ever asked. Now the thunder sounded different, less like fear, more like applause. I smiled to myself, a small private smile. When I got back into the car, I checked the time, 11:48. Just 12 minutes until midnight, until a new day. I imagined the deed waiting for my signature, the keys resting on a lawyer's desk, gleaming in their metal perfection. That house would be quiet, yes, but it would be my kind of quiet. The kind that didn't punish or suffocate, but healed. As I drove the last stretch toward my hotel near the airport, I caught myself humming. The melody wasn't familiar, but it felt right, steady, low and sure. Outside, the rain eased into mist. The highway opened ahead like a path no one had ever walked before. When I finally parked, I sat for a moment with my hands on the wheel, letting the silence settle around me. My phone buzzed, once Lydia's name flashing on the screen. I didn't answer. She could keep her party, her applause, her empty house full of framed moments. I had something better waiting, a place untouched by their voices. I turned the phone face down, leaned back, and closed my eyes. For the first time in years, the silence didn't ache. It felt like breathing. Tomorrow, I thought, I'll stand at the edge of the Colorado mountains. Tomorrow, I'll walk barefoot through rooms that echo only with peace. And for once, I won't need anyone to see me to know that I exist. The same light used to sneak through the crack above my bed, the one that stretched down the wall like a scar. It was thin, pale, and steady, the only thing that ever visited that room without judgment. Every morning it painted the dust motes gold for a few minutes, before fading like it pitied the space it touched. That was the room no one wanted, the one beside the staircase next to the pipes that hissed and moaned in winter. They said I was the strong one, so I got the smallest room. Strength apparently came with less space. The walls were an uneven beige that had once been white, and the carpet smelled faintly of damp cardboard, no matter how many times I vacuumed. When I lay in bed, I could hear the plumbing like a restless animal inside the walls. I used to count the creaks and rattles until I fell asleep. Mom called it cozy, said it had character. But it was really a hallway with a door pretending to be a bedroom. Lydia's room, on the other hand, had lace curtains and 2 windows that faced east. The sun kissed her awake every morning while I woke to the sound of pipes groaning under the floor. She called her room the palace, and everyone laughed like it was true. Lydia was the family's masterpiece. Even her laughter had its own echo in the house. When she sang, Mom recorded it on her phone. When she tripped, Dad rushed over with concern. When I did well on a test, Mom said, "Good. Help your sister study." I learned early that praise was a shared resource and Lydia had lifetime ownership. I didn't resent her, not then. I just accepted that my role was to make sure everything around her kept running. When she caught a cold, I made tea. When Mom had a headache, I went to the pharmacy. When Dad forgot to pay the electric bill, I folded laundry by flashlight until it came back on. I thought that's what good daughters did. One evening when I was 12, I brought home my first perfect report card. Straight A's. I waited until after dinner when the house was quiet. Mom was washing dishes, Dad reading the paper, Lydia painting her nails at the table. I laid the paper down like an offering. "That's wonderful, honey," Mom said without looking up. Then after a pause she added, "Can you quiz your sister for her math test?" Lydia smirked without lifting her head. I said sure because saying no always sounded like defiance. That night, as I erased the pencil marks from Lydia's worksheet, I realized good didn't mean visible. It just meant quiet. Dad's rules were simple: don't argue, don't make a scene, don't give him a reason to put the paper down. He called it discipline. Mom called it peace. I called it air that never moved. Once I told him the room by the stairs was too damp, that my blankets smelled like mildew. He turned a page and said, "At least you're not sleeping outside." That was the end of it. So I learned to stop asking. Asking implied wanting, and wanting made people uncomfortable. Silence was easier. It got me through birthdays where Lydia blew out 12 candles while I cut the cake. Through Christmas mornings where her pile of gifts towered next to my 2 boxes of socks and secondhand books. Through nights when the pipes banged like fists on the walls and I pretended it was applause for how well I could disappear. If I stayed quiet, no one could call me ungrateful. If I stayed quiet, maybe they'd finally think I was strong. On Lydia's 10th birthday, the house filled with children wearing shiny shoes and voices too loud for the small living room. Mom hung pink streamers and baked a cake with her name, written in looping white frosting. I was told to stay in the kitchen and help with the plates. The laughter spilled in like sunlight spilling across the linoleum floor to where I stood rinsing glasses. When the candles went out, I peeked around the doorway. Lydia's face glowed in the afterlight, everyone clapping. For a second, she looked like the center of the universe. Then she saw me watching and said, "Close the door, Evelyn, it's drafty." Everyone laughed. I smiled because that was what strong girls did. Later that night, after the guests left, I found a half-melted candle on the counter. I lit it, whispered a wish I never said aloud, then blew it out. It was the only birthday candle I ever owned. Dad was a man of order, not affection. He believed fairness was about who caused the least trouble. When Lydia stayed out late, he said, "She's finding herself." When I came home 5 minutes past curfew after tutoring, he waited at the door, eyes sharp, voice low. "If you can't follow rules, you'll end up lost." I wanted to tell him I was already lost, but strong girls didn't talk like that. They nodded and said, "Yes, sir." He liked that answer. He said it showed respect. Once, when I was carrying the laundry down the stairs, my foot slipped on the second step. I tumbled halfway down the basket, scattering socks and detergent everywhere. My knee bled through my jeans. Dad came out of the den, frowned, and said, "Be careful next time." Then he stepped over the mess and went back inside. A week later, Lydia tripped over her own shoelace on the driveway. Dad sprinted out, scooped her up, and shouted for Mom to bring ice. I watched from the porch and realized the only difference between us was who people believed was worth saving. When I was 14, I tried to change rooms for the summer. I asked if we could switch just for a few months. Dad laughed. "Your sister's room has stairs. You want her falling and breaking something." I didn't remind him that I'd already fallen. It wouldn't have mattered. That's when I stopped asking to trade spaces. I built one inside my head, instead quiet, safe, unreachable. On rainy nights when thunder crawled through the sky, Lydia would run into our parents' room. I'd stay behind, counting seconds between the lightning and the rumble. I wasn't brave. I was just used to being alone. I'd draw the house I wanted one day, a place with windows that faced mountains, not walls, a house that didn't smell like someone else's life. I sketched it in pencil on the back of old worksheets, labeling it someday. It was my secret rebellion. While Lydia dreamed of applause, I dreamed of silence that belonged to me. I started keeping a notebook under my pillow filled with things I couldn't say aloud. I wrote about the smell of the damp carpet, the sound of Dad's newspaper folding, the ache in my chest when Mom said, "Your sister just needs more from us. I never showed anyone." The notebook was my truest voice, the one I'd never been punished for using. The last page of that first notebook had one line written across it. "If being good doesn't earn love, then I'll earn something else." I didn't know yet what that would be. I only knew it would take me far from that house, far from the sound of pipes and the taste of swallowed words. Years later, when people asked where I learned discipline, I said from my parents. It was true in a way. They taught me patience, endurance, silence. They taught me that comfort could be a cage, and that strength wasn't in shouting, it was in surviving what others dismissed. On the morning I left for college, I stood in that small room one last time. The sunlight cut through the crack in the wall, landing across my empty bed. I traced it with my fingers like saying goodbye to a bruise that finally faded. The floor creaked softly under my suitcase wheels. Mom called from the kitchen. "Did you pack your lunch?" I said yes, though I hadn't. Dad honked from the driveway, already impatient. Lydia was upstairs playing music, her laughter echoing through the vents. Before closing the door, I looked back at the tiny space and whispered, "Thank you for teaching me what I deserve." The radiator hissed one last time like it understood. Then I walked out. By the time I reached the airport, the light had changed. The air smelled different, drier, cleaner. I didn't know where I'd end up, but I knew where I wouldn't return. The room by the staircase wasn't mine anymore. It never was. But one day, I promised myself I'd stand in a room filled with sunlight and say, "This belongs to me." The smell of oil and dust always lingered in the garage. I liked it that way. It was the only place in the house that felt like mine. On most afternoons after school, I sat cross-legged on the concrete floor surrounded by broken radios and loose wires I'd rescued from neighbors' trash. When I managed to fix something, a crackle of sound, a light flicker, it was like catching proof that I existed. Once Dad walked in, saw me holding the soldering iron, and frowned. "Why waste time on junk?" he muttered before going back inside. I wiped my hands on a rag and switched on the radio. It hummed to life, a burst of static followed by a song from decades ago. I smiled to no one. When no one clapped, I learned to be my own applause. By 16, I'd already discovered that logic made more sense than people. Machines didn't lie. Circuits either worked or didn't, and you could trace every failure to a reason. I started tutoring classmates for cash-buying spare parts and sneaking time on the school computers to teach myself coding. Mom didn't approve. "That's for boys," she said one morning, flipping pancakes for Lydia's friends. "Take something graceful." "Maybe piano again?" I didn't answer. Dad grunted from behind his newspaper. Lydia, lounging at the table, added, "You'll end up fixing microwaves, not dreams." I smiled tightly and finished my toast. That night, I stayed up until 2 a.m., building a small model bridge with blinking LED lights that simulated traffic flow. It worked perfectly on the first try, I whispered to myself. If no one builds bridges for you, build your own. I hid the model under my bed. Sometimes when the house was dark, I turned it on just to watch the little lights move in rhythm. They looked like a tiny city that belonged to me. It was the same year I realized that surviving wasn't enough. I wanted out. Out of the house, out of being the strong one, out of every whispered conversation that ended with, "She'll be fine." I began collecting college brochures, circling scholarships that offered full rides and housing. I didn't have savings, but I had grades, and grades could open doors. The acceptance letter came in spring, folded neatly inside a white envelope from the University of Washington. I'd checked the mailbox every day for weeks, my heart racing every time I heard the metal slot creak. When it finally arrived, I held it like it might burn through my hands. The words "full scholarship engineering program" looked unreal, too clean to belong to my messy life. I cried quietly in my room, the one by the staircase that still smelled like old paint. I thought maybe this time they'd be proud. At dinner, I waited until Lydia finished talking about her audition for choir solo. When the room finally fell quiet, I said I got into college, full scholarship, engineering. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Mom blinked, folded her napkin, and said, "That's far. How will you manage, Dad?" asked. "Can you afford to leave?" I told them I didn't need anything. It was all covered. Lydia twirled her hair and said, "You'll be back in a month. You hate change." I stared at her for a second, searching for something that might resemble affection, but all I saw was amusement. I smiled instead. "We'll see." The room felt colder after that. Mom started clearing plates before I finished eating. Dad opened the newspaper again. Lydia hummed a tune from her upcoming recital. I sat there invisible until the silence pressed too hard against my chest. That night I packed one of my old duffel bags and left it half-zipped at the corner of my bed. I wasn't leaving yet, but I needed to see what my life might look like in motion. My clothes barely filled half the bag. I touched the wall by the bed, tracing the crack that had been there since I was 6. "Next time I unpack," I whispered, "it'll be somewhere with sunlight." The morning I left for the university, the house smelled like coffee and dust. Mom handed me a lunch bag, turkey sandwich, no mustard, just how I liked it, but her face was tight. "Call if you need anything," she said, knowing I wouldn't. Dad was waiting in the car, engine running. Lydia stood by the door, arms crossed, hair perfectly curled. "Don't make it sound like you're escaping," she said. "I'm not escaping," I replied softly. "I'm beginning." The drive was silent. Dad tapped the steering wheel, eyes fixed on the road. When we reached the airport, he didn't park. I got out with my single suitcase, thanked him, and shut the door. He nodded once before pulling away. The wind was sharp and the world suddenly felt enormous. For the first time I was alone, and it didn't scare me. Seattle greeted me with gray skies and drizzle. The air smelled like rain, and something new, possibility maybe. My dorm room was small, barely larger than my old one, but it had a window that looked out onto the campus lawn. The first morning I opened the curtains and let the light pour in. It felt like breathing after years underwater. My roommate, a cheerful girl from Oregon, talked about weekend plans and study groups. I listened, smiled, but didn't share much. I wasn't used to being asked questions that didn't end with chores. Days turned into weeks. My classes were hard, but they made sense. Equations obeyed rules that families didn't. My professor, a woman named Dr. Harper, noticed me one afternoon in lab. I'd stayed late reworking a mechanical arm prototype that refused to align properly. She walked over, adjusted her glasses, and asked, "You've been here 3 hours, haven't you?" I nodded. "You see patterns others overlook," she said. "Don't shrink because no one claps." Her words sank deep. For the first time, someone spoke to me like I wasn't a background character. Dr. Harper became my mentor. She taught me how to present my work, how to take up space without apology. One afternoon, as we walked across campus under soft rain, she said, "The world doesn't owe you recognition, but it can't erase competence." I carried that line like armor. At night, I sometimes stared at my phone, half expecting a message from home. The screen stayed dark. Once Mom called. I answered quickly, heart pounding. "Your sister's engagement is next week," she said. "You should come." I hesitated. "I have finals." "Lydia's future is important," she insisted. I wanted to ask if mine wasn't, but I didn't. When the call ended, I looked at my reflection in the black screen. "I used to build things to be closer to you," I whispered. "Now I build to stay standing without you." The following summer, Dr. Harper helped me apply for an internship in Denver, a small tech company that specialized in automation tools. When I got the offer, I cried again, but not from sadness. It was relief, a quiet triumph. Before leaving, Dr. Harper gave me a blank notebook. "Fill it with the life they couldn't imagine for you," she said. I promised I would. The trip to Colorado felt like a dream. The bus wound through mountains capped with snow past rivers that glittered like glass. I pressed my forehead to the window, tracing the peaks with my eyes. For once I didn't feel like I was running away. I was moving toward something. Each mile stretched the distance between me and the house that had kept me small. That night when the bus stopped for a rest, I stepped outside. The air was cold and clean, filled with pine and silence. Above me, the stars hung close enough to touch. I closed my eyes and let the wind wash over me. I didn't know what waited ahead, a job, a new city maybe, people who'd see me for who I was. But I knew one thing for certain. The bridge I'd built inside my head as a girl had finally found its other side. When I climbed back on the bus, I opened Dr. Harper's notebook and wrote the first line, "I'm done building from silence. Now I build with it." The engine rumbled to life, and the lights along the highway blurred into a golden thread stretching across the dark. By the time the bus climbed higher into the mountains, dawn began to color the horizon. The peaks caught the first light, sharp and beautiful. I stared out, realizing I was seeing the world from a height I'd only drawn in dreams. I didn't know it yet, but Colorado would be where my silence turned into power. The bus hissed to a stop in the middle of downtown Denver, where the air smelled like pine and exhaust, and faint traces of burnt coffee. The city felt larger than anything I had known, glass towers glinting in the pale autumn sun, the Rockies rising behind them like a wall of quiet guardians. I stepped off the bus with my single suitcase, and Dr. Harper's notebook clutched to my chest. It didn't look like freedom, but it felt like it. My heart beat steady, not from fear, but from the strange peace of being unseen. The company office sat on the third floor of a brick building with a faded sign that read Wendell Automation. Inside, the air was thick with the hum of computers and the hiss of espresso machines. Desks were cluttered with wires, notes, and energy drinks. My title was intern, but no one bothered to explain much beyond that. They handed me a login, a half-broken chair, and told me to keep up. I didn't mind. It felt like home in a different language. The first few weeks were chaos. Deadlines shifted, code broke, tempers flared. I stayed quiet, learning patterns, mapping personalities like algorithms. When someone snapped at me, I apologized, fixed the error, and moved on. One afternoon, after I corrected a bug that had stalled a project for days, the lead engineer nodded at me without looking up. "Good catch." It was the smallest acknowledgement, but it filled the space that silence used to occupy. Then there was Rachel Lynn. She was the technical director, 40-something, sharp, calm, always wearing black cardigans and silver earrings that looked like drops of rain. Rachel didn't waste words. The first time she stopped at my desk, I thought I'd done something wrong. "You rewrote the logic on this patch," she said, pointing at my screen. "Show me." I did, nervous, but clear. She watched the lines scroll, then nodded once. "You just saved us 3 weeks. Then she walked away. That night I stayed at the office long after everyone left, staring at my code until the numbers blurred. No one had ever said something like that to me before. Over the next months, Rachel became the quiet axis of my days. She wasn't kind in the soft way my mother claimed kindness was hers, was steel-wrapped honesty. She corrected me without apology, taught me to speak up during meetings even when my voice trembled. "If you disappear in your own work," she said, "once someone else will take the credit. Don't make it easy for them." Sometimes after hours, we stayed in the office long enough to see the cleaning crew arrive. She'd sit across from me, sipping tea, the screen glow cutting lines across her face. "You know," she said one night, "being underestimated is a kind of power. It lets you watch how people behave when they think you're harmless." I didn't answer, but I remembered every word. By spring, they offered me a full-time position, the youngest engineer in the company. During the meeting, the CEO smiled politely and said, "She's quiet, but she gets things done." Everyone chuckled like it was a compliment. Rachel didn't laugh. She just leaned over and whispered, "Quiet doesn't mean small." A week later, a local tech blog ran a feature on women in engineering. There was a photo of me taken without warning while I was wiring a prototype. The caption read, "Evelyn Callahan Breaking Stereotypes in Automation." I printed the article and slipped it into my notebook between two blank pages. I didn't send it home. I'd stopped expecting applause from people who never clapped. Then came Julian Cross. He arrived one Monday morning, all confidence and charm, a new developer with tousled blonde hair and a knack for making everyone laugh. He was quick, too quick, and people loved him for it. He sat 2 desks away and started asking me questions on his first day. At first they were simple file paths, variable errors, syntax quirks. Then they became conversations. "You think machines are predictable?" he asked one afternoon. "More than people," I replied. He grinned. "That's why I like them too." Julian was different from anyone I'd worked with, bright, curious, relentlessly ambitious. We collaborated on small projects, and for a while it worked. He made the room feel lighter, the long hours bearable. But there were moments, brief and sharp, that unsettled me. Like when he'd take my ideas during team meetings, rephrase them, and suddenly everyone would nod. Rachel noticed. One evening after he left, she said quietly, "Be careful who claps the loudest. Some applause is for themselves." I smiled but said nothing. I wanted to believe Julian was different. I always wanted to believe. Around that time, Mom called for the first time in months. I saw her name flash on the screen and hesitated before answering. "Your sister's business is booming," she said cheerfully. "She's been featured in a magazine." "That's nice," I replied, my voice steady. "Still working at that computer place?" she asked. "Still building things," I said. There was a pause. I imagined her in the kitchen, wiping her hands with a towel, half distracted. "Lydia's thinking of starting her own company. You should give her advice. You're good with numbers." "I think she'll be fine," I said, then ended the call before the silence could start circling me again. When I looked up, the office was empty except for Rachel packing her laptop. She gave me a knowing look but didn't ask. We both understood what wasn't said. A few months later, Rachel announced she was leaving the company. A better position, higher pay, less chaos. Her departure felt like gravity shifting. On her last day, she handed me a flash drive. "This has my project notes," she said. "Use them if you need a reminder that you belong." I wanted to thank her, but the words stuck in my throat. She smiled faintly. "You'll figure out how to speak louder without shouting. You already know how to listen." After she left, Julian took over as lead developer. He congratulated me on my promotion to project manager, grinning like we were partners in a shared dream. "We could build something together, you know," he said. "You've got the logic, I've got the charm." It sounded half joking, half serious. I laughed, not realizing I was hearing the opening line of a story that would break me. That night, the company hosted a small celebration for our latest product launch. I stood in the corner, nursing a glass of soda while others toasted. Julian made a short speech full of bravado and plans for the next big thing. He caught my eye across the room, raised his glass slightly. I smiled, back out of habit more than feeling. The music swelled, and for a fleeting second I felt something warm, hope maybe. When the party ended, I walked home under a drizzle that turned the city lights into streaks of gold. My reflection followed me in every puddle, calm face, tired eyes, posture straight but weary. I thought about Rachel's warning about the way people applauded when they wanted something. I thought about my mother's voice, Lydia's endless spotlight, the years of being told silence was strength. I reached my apartment, small and cluttered with the hum of the heater filling the air. On the desk lay Dr. Harper's notebook, still half empty. I opened it and wrote a single line. When the world finally saw me, I realized it didn't owe me anything, but I owed myself everything. I closed the notebook, turned off the lights, and stood by the window. Outside, Denver glittered under the thin veil of rain, full of noise and stories I didn't yet know. Somewhere in that restless city, I had found my first real audience, a woman who believed in me, a man I shouldn't have trusted, and a version of myself who was finally learning that silence could be more than survival. Tomorrow would be another beginning, another test. But for tonight, I let the city hum for me. I was no longer the girl by the staircase. I was the woman behind the screen building the kind of world where no one would ever have to ask for permission to be seen. Snow fell softly outside the window, flakes drifting like pieces of ash against the Denver skyline. The office was almost empty, only the hum of the heater and the faint tapping of my keyboard breaking the quiet. Julian sat across from me, coffee cup half full, eyes bright with something restless. "You ever think about what's next?" he asked suddenly. I didn't look up. "Next after this job. After we've built 100 things for someone else. We could do it ourselves, you know. You and me." He turned the laptop toward me. On the screen was a rough sketch of a financial app, simple, intuitive, modern. "We could call it Northlight," he said. "Because people need something to guide them out of the dark." I smiled faintly. "You came up with that," he shrugged. "You'll make it work." It was a good idea, and he knew it. Something about his conviction was infectious. Maybe because I wanted to believe in something or someone. Within a month, we quit our jobs. We rented a small basement office with 2 desks, a flickering lamp, and a coffee maker that spat more steam than liquid. We wrote code until our fingers cramped, lived on cheap noodles, and kept a list of goals taped to the wall: 10,000 users, seed funding, press coverage. Every time we crossed one out, Julian would grin and say, "Told you we'd make it." At first I thought we were unstoppable. We called it partnership, but I did most of the back-end work, algorithms, testing, bug reports. Julian was the front man, pitching to investors, doing interviews, saying all the right words. "We're building a bridge between people and their money," he'd say with that perfect smile. I stayed behind the camera, in the glow of the monitor where I was used to living. It didn't bother me at first. I'd always been the quiet one, the unseen one. When Northlight hit 10,000 downloads, we celebrated with cold pizza and flat soda. "To us," he said, raising his cup. "To the strong one," I replied. He didn't understand the weight of those words. The months blurred together. We moved from the basement to a shared co-working space with glass walls and fake plants. Our name was stenciled in white on the door: Northlight Technologies. I stared at it every morning like a promise. We hired a small team, 2 developers and a designer. I worked 16-hour days, sometimes sleeping on the couch, waking to find Julian gone, his half of the desk empty. He said he was networking, but the smell of whiskey and cologne told another story. Still, I defended him. To the investors, to the team, to myself. Because believing in him was easier than admitting I was alone again. A year later, we were on the cover of a local startup magazine. The headline read, "The Man Bringing Simplicity to FinTech." His photo took up half the page. My name was buried in the last paragraph: co-founder and lead engineer. When I showed him, he laughed. "You know how these things go. They need one face." I smiled because that was the language I knew best. The small cracks started to show after that. He took longer lunch breaks, came back with new contacts and old excuses. I noticed new emails from unknown investors marked private. When I asked, he brushed it off. Just conversations. One afternoon, I opened the company inbox and saw an unfamiliar subject line: "Term sheet review, Brightline Ventures." The email had been forwarded from Julian's personal account. My name wasn't on the thread. I read it twice, the words blurring. They were negotiating a buyout. Without me. That night I stayed late waiting. He arrived just after 9, phone pressed to his ear. "Yeah, I can deliver the algorithm by next quarter," he said. My heart sank. He looked up startled. "Oh, you're still here." "Who's we?" I asked quietly. He froze. "It's not what you think." "It never is," I said. "You're selling Northlight." He ran a hand through his hair. "It's business eve. You get too emotional about these things." Emotional? I laughed once, sharp and bitter. "You're stealing the one thing I built that didn't have their fingerprints on it." "You were too slow," he said softly. "I'm just finishing what we started." I stared at him for a long time. Then I said, "I hope the noise you chase is worth the silence you'll earn." He didn't answer. He didn't need to. 2 weeks later, the investors pulled out. The money dried up. We couldn't meet payroll. Our employees began to disappear one by one, chairs left pushed back from desks, coffee mugs still half full. The office emptied like a tide pulling out to sea. On our last day, I held a meeting in the kitchen, near the broken coffee machine that had witnessed everything. I told the team the truth, no drama, no blame, just facts. I promised to help them find new jobs, wrote recommendations, sent introductions. They thanked me quietly, eyes down like mourners at a funeral. When they left, I stayed behind. The space felt hollow, the sound of my footsteps echoing too loud. I packed the files unplugged, the monitors wiped, the whiteboard clean. The word "million users" was still circled in red marker. I stood there for a long moment, then erased it. The last thing I did was remove the glass plaque with our name from the door. It came off with a soft crack, leaving a faint outline of dust. I held it against my knees and sat on the floor, staring at the ghost of our logo. Outside, the city lights shimmered like indifferent stars. When I finally left, the streets were slick with snow. I walked until my breath came in small clouds, until my feet ached from cold. I didn't cry. There was nothing left to spill out. At home, I set the plaque on the counter and turned on my laptop. The empty screen blinked, waiting. I opened a new document and wrote the first line, "For those who were underestimated." I stared at it until the words steadied me. Then I added, "For those who build in silence." I didn't know what it would become, but I knew it was mine. Over the next few weeks, I woke up before dawn, coding in the dim light of my kitchen while the city still slept. The rhythm returned: build, break, fix, repeat. The work became my heartbeat. I didn't talk to anyone about Julian. I didn't check the news. But one morning I saw his name trending online. Northlight acquired by Brightline Ventures. Founding CEO joins leadership team. They called him visionary. They didn't mention me at all. I smiled faintly and closed the page. I'd spent most of my life trying to be seen, but now invisibility felt like armor. The snow thickened that night, piling against the window. I stood there watching it, the world hushed, the air blue with cold. Somewhere in another city he was probably celebrating. That was fine, let him have the noise. I had something quieter and stronger. By the time the clock hit midnight, I had a name for my new project, Lantern. It wasn't just code, it was a promise. I closed my laptop and leaned back in the chair, exhaustion settling in. Around me, the apartment was silent, except for the hum of the heater and the faint crackle of snow against the glass. He took my company, but he didn't take what built at me. Outside, the snow kept falling, blanketing the streets, the rooftops, the old wounds. It covered everything that had cracked open, smoothing the world into something clean and new. Some endings aren't punishment, they're permission. The first winter after Northlight fell was the coldest I'd ever known. Snow layered the streets of Denver like sheets of glass, the kind that caught the light and burned your eyes if you looked too long. I rented a small apartment above a bakery that smelled like sugar and smoke. And every morning I woke before sunrise to the sound of delivery trucks backing into the alley. I'd pull on an oversized sweater, make coffee that tasted like burnt hope, and open my laptop. The screen's glow was the only warmth in the room. Lantern began as a whisper. Just a single folder named Project on my desktop. I didn't even know what it would be, only what it wouldn't. It wouldn't be built on charm or empty promises. It wouldn't have a spokesperson. It wouldn't pretend to shine for the sake of attention. It would be quiet, useful, alive. The first few weeks were chaos disguised as purpose. I filled notebooks with sketches, mind maps, lines of code that went nowhere. My table was buried under sticky notes and receipts covered in scribbles. I tested algorithms on scraps of paper, modeling data flow while the snow pressed hard against the windows. I barely slept, afraid that if I stopped, the silence would remind me that I had lost everything. But then one night, as the city's hum faded beneath a fresh layer of snow, I realized something I wasn't building to forget. I was building to begin again. By February, Lantern had a name. I wrote it on the top of a page in block letters: Lantern, a financial platform that adapts to the people who need it most. Not users, not clients, people. I wanted it to feel human, to understand struggle without shame. Still, I couldn't do it alone. I needed a team small, sharp, and quiet like me. That's how I found Rachel again. She'd left Wendell Automation months before Northlight collapsed. I emailed her late one night, building something new. Need someone who knows how to turn silence into strategy. Interested, her reply came an hour later. You've got 2 weeks before I say yes or no. Show me something real. I didn't sleep after that. I coded until my fingers cramped, creating the first skeleton of Lantern, an adaptive algorithm that adjusted to users' financial habits rather than penalizing them. When Rachel saw the demo, she smiled faintly. You built this in a month? No, I said. I built it in 10 years of being ignored. She laughed, once quiet and proud. Then, let's make it louder. We started meeting in coffee shops and borrowed conference rooms. Rachel brought in Marcus, a compliance expert, who had left a major bank because he couldn't stand watching people be punished for being poor. Together, the three of us created what Northlight never could, a foundation built on empathy and math. By spring, Lantern had its first test users, a single mom from Boulder, a laid-off factory worker from Pueblo, a college student drowning in loan interest. We didn't advertise, we just listened. Every message they sent, every bug report, every piece of feedback mattered more than any investor pitch ever could. Sometimes late at night, I'd get an email that stopped me cold. One woman wrote, "This helped me save for my daughter's braces. Thank you for seeing people like me." I sat at my kitchen table and cried until the coffee went cold. It wasn't joy or relief, it was recognition. The kind I'd spent a lifetime chasing from people who never offered it. 6 months later, Rachel insisted we move into a real office, a modest 2-room space in downtown San Jose. If you want to build something big, she said, you need a home for it. I agreed, though. The word home still made me flinch. We worked like we were racing time. Rachel managed strategy, Marcus handled regulation, and I became the quiet architect of every feature. We weren't chasing money, we were chasing precision. If it works for a single mother who's behind on rent, I told them it'll work for everyone else. We launched the beta quietly, no ads, no press release, just an email list and a promise. Within a week, the waiting list doubled. Within a month, we had more users than Northlight did in its first year. Rachel looked at the numbers and grinned. Still think silence can't sell, she teased. I shook my head. It's not selling, I said. It's listening. When the first media outlet reached out for an interview, Rachel stepped forward as the public face. She didn't ask if I wanted to be in the spotlight, and I didn't offer. It was better this way. She was polished, articulate, confident. I stayed behind the curtain, building and refining, letting her take the applause. You're the ghost in the code, she joked once. The machine that hums behind the heartbeat. I prefer it that way, I said. And I did. 2 years passed like that. Lantern grew faster than we imagined. We filed a patent for our adaptive engine, secured small grants, and won quiet awards that most people didn't read. Still, I never told my family. Mom's number sat in my phone like a locked file. Lydia's name occasionally appeared on social media headlines, another feature, another photo shoot. I scrolled past each one without stopping. The truth was, I didn't need them to see me anymore. I had built something that did the seeing for me. In December, Rachel and I attended a tech summit in San Francisco. The conference hall was a maze of glass and noise, full of people who spoke in buzzwords and caffeine. Lantern had been invited to demo on stage. Rachel would present. I would watch from the crowd. The booth was small, just a monitor looping our interface, and a bowl of mints we forgot to refill. Rachel stood tall in her black blazer, walking the audience through the software with calm precision. Lantern learns you, she said. It doesn't punish you for being human. Then came the Q&A. A man in a pinstripe suit raised his hand. Who's the architect behind your logic grid? Rachel hesitated for a breath, then smiled. We're a collaborative team, the man smirked. Funny. The patent lists an E. Callahan as lead contributor. Is she here? Rachel glanced at me. I shook my head slightly. She turned back to the crowd. She prefers to let the product speak. A murmur swept through the audience, part curiosity, part admiration. I sat perfectly still. For the first time, my name had been said aloud in a room full of power, and I didn't feel the need to stand up. Afterward, Rachel found me in the hallway. You okay? She asked. I nodded. He wasn't wrong. I just don't want to be seen through someone else's lens again. You don't owe them a face, she said softly. You built something better than that. That night, I walked along the Embarcadero alone. The air smelled of salt and cold metal. Across the bay, the bridge lights flickered like a pulse. I stopped and stared at the water, its surface trembling with reflections. For years, I had wanted the world to see me. Now I realized I had built something that didn't need my face to exist. That was freedom. The next morning, we received our first acquisition offer. A company 3 times our size wanted to buy Lantern outright. Rachel's eyes widened when she saw the number. You could own half of Colorado with this, she said. I laughed quietly. Maybe just the mountains. We didn't say yes. Not yet. Lantern wasn't finished. It was still learning about people, about patience, about light. That night, as snow began to fall outside our small office, I stayed late. The city dimmed, the streets went silent, and the reflection of the monitor turned the window into a mirror. I looked at myself, the same woman who once lived beside a staircase, who once begged for space, and I smiled. Lantern glowed softly on the screen, a pulse of gold against the dark. I whispered to it, "We're not done yet." And for the first time in my life, the silence answered back, not with emptiness, but with peace. The invitation came in a cream-colored envelope, heavy and expensive, the kind used for weddings and apologies. My name was written in neat cursive across the front, Evelyn Callahan, and beneath it a return address I hadn't seen in over a decade. Austin. I almost threw it away. For a long moment, I just stood at the kitchen counter, fingers resting on the paper, as the coffee machine hissed behind me. Then, I tore it open. Inside was a glossy card printed with gold lettering, "Join us to celebrate Lydia Callahan's 30th birthday." On the back, a photo of her smiling glass of champagne, raised hair styled like sunlight. At the bottom in blue ink, a note I recognized immediately. "Hope you can make it home, sweetheart. Love, Mom. Home." The word looked foreign now, like something translated poorly from another language. I set the invitation down and stared at it until the gold letters blurred. My phone buzzed on the counter, an email from Rachel about a grant proposal, but I didn't open it. All I could think about was the way Mom still used that word, as if nothing had ever cracked. That night, I poured a glass of wine and sat by the window. The mountains outside were fading into darkness, the last edge of snow catching the moonlight. I told myself I didn't care, that it was just another party, another performance for the family's favorite daughter. But something beneath that thought wouldn't settle. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the version of me that still wanted to be seen, even if it meant walking into the same fire again. The next morning, I emailed a small vineyard outside Santa Rosa and ordered a bottle of Cabernet they didn't sell in stores. I packed it in a paper bag and slipped it beside an old painting I'd kept for years, a watercolor of golden reeds by a lake. It was something Mom used to love, a piece she said, reminded her of Vermont, though we'd never been there. When my flight landed in Austin, the humidity wrapped around me like a memory I didn't want to touch. I stood at the curb holding the wine through the paper bag and waited for a rideshare. The driver asked if I was visiting family. I said something like that. The house looked exactly the same. Blue shutters, gravel driveway, wind chimes tangled in each other. I stood at the gate for a second too long, listening to the hum of conversation and laughter spilling out the open windows. Then I knocked. Dad opened the door. He looked older, smaller somehow, but his eyes were the same shade of distant. "You came," he said, surprise and discomfort tangled in his voice. I lifted the bottle and the painting. Figured she had enough candles. He chuckled once awkwardly, then stepped aside. Come in! The living room was full of people, friends, cousins' faces from old photos I hadn't seen in years. The air smelled of perfume and catered food, the kind of sweetness that clung to everything. Lydia stood by the fireplace in a white dress, her laughter slicing through the noise. She was radiant, confident, exactly as I remembered. Mom spotted me first. You look well, she said, the words landing somewhere between greeting and assessment. So do you, I replied, handing her the painting. Her eyes widened. You kept this, I remember. You loved it. She smiled, genuine for a heartbeat, then turned away to greet someone else. That brief warmth vanished like steam from a kettle. I stayed near the hallway, holding a glass of wine, watching the party from the periphery. People toasted Lydia, told stories about her generosity, her brilliance, her future. No one mentioned me. I didn't expect them to. Aunt Claire approached, eyes squinting like she was trying to recognize a ghost. Evelyn, my goodness, it's been years. Still doing tech stuff. Yes. She nodded, clearly unsure what that meant, then drifted off before I could say anything more. Dinner was served outside under strings of lights. The table stretched across the backyard, lined with gold-rimmed plates and polished silverware. I chose a seat at the far end. Lydia sat at the head, glowing under the lights like the centerpiece. When the speeches began, I kept my eyes on my plate. Mom raised her glass first. To my beautiful girl who's never stopped making us proud. Dad followed. You've always been the light in this family. People clapped. Lydia beamed. I took a small sip of wine. Then Lydia stood, glass in hand. I just want to thank everyone for being here. 30 feels big, but it feels right. I'm surrounded by love, and that's all that matters. Applause again. She waited until it quieted. And let's not forget my big sister Evelyn, she added suddenly, eyes locking on me. The one who disappeared for years. You guys probably didn't even know I had a sister, right? The laughter that followed was sharp and polite. Seriously, she continued. Where did you go, Evelyn? Witness protection. No LinkedIn, no photos, no headlines. I mean, did you get abducted by monks or something? A few guests chuckled. My stomach turned. I set my glass down carefully. Mom's face froze in a smile. Dad sipped his wine. Lydia smirked, waiting for a reaction. When I didn't give her one, she leaned forward slightly. Come on, say something. Remind us you exist. I stood up slowly. I think I already did. Her smile faltered. If you can't be part of the celebration, she said, her tone sharper, now maybe you shouldn't be here. The silence that followed was heavier than any sound I'd ever known. Then Mom laughed light and quick, like static trying to fill the air. Oh, Lydia, don't be dramatic. But Lydia didn't stop. No, really. Some people just show up to make things uncomfortable. The way she said it made it sound like a verdict. I looked at her, then at the faces around the table, people pretending to sip their drinks, pretending not to see. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I just turned toward the gate. The gravel crunched beneath my shoes. The wind chimes clattered above the porch. No one followed. At the curb, I opened my phone and ordered a ride. My hands shook, not from anger, but from something quieter. Disbelief, maybe. Or the final weight of an answer I'd known for years. As the car pulled up, I caught my reflection in the window, calm, dry-eyed, composed. Inside the house, laughter started again, muffled but bright. They'd move on quickly. They always did. When the driver asked where to, I said the airport. He nodded and turned up the radio. I watched the lights of the neighborhood fade into distance, the houses shrinking into silhouettes. At a red light, he glanced in the mirror. You okay? I smiled faintly. Never better. He didn't believe me, but he didn't press. By the time we reached the airport, the sky had turned the color of steel. Planes blinked on the horizon, and a thin layer of fog curled over the runway. I changed my ticket at the counter, booked the red-eye back to Denver. While I waited at the gate, I took out my phone. The unopened bottle of wine sat somewhere on Lydia's table forgotten. The painting I'd given Mom would probably end up in the attic. I scrolled through old photos, stopped at one from years ago, Lydia and me as kids, both in white dresses. She was smiling at the camera. I was looking off to the side at something no one else saw. I closed the photo and turned off the phone. When my flight was called, I picked up my bag and walked toward the gate without looking back. Somewhere below the clouds, Austin disappeared behind me. Ahead, the dark line of the Rockies waited. I rested my head against the window and let the hum of the plane carry me home. For the first time, I understood that silence wasn't surrender. It was the sound of letting go. Los Angeles was still half asleep when my plane landed. The light over the city was gold and faintly pink, the kind of sunrise that made the ocean shimmer like glass. I carried one small suitcase, the same one I'd taken to Austin, still packed with clothes I hadn't worn and gifts I hadn't given. I didn't stop for coffee or call anyone. I just moved through the terminal past strangers, dragging their own stories behind them and out into the cool coastal air. The car I'd arranged months ago was waiting at the curb. "Good morning, Miss Callahan," the driver said, opening the door. I nodded and slid into the back seat. As we pulled away from the airport, the skyline slipped behind us. The freeway opened wide and empty, stretching toward the cliffs that curved along the Pacific. When the road narrowed to a winding lane surrounded by pale hills, he asked, "New place?" "Something like that," I said. He smiled politely in the mirror, then let the silence take over. By the time we reached Malibu, the sun had fully risen, washing the ocean in silver. The mansion sat at the end of a quiet road, its gates tall and black against the morning light. No neighbors in sight, only the rhythmic crash of waves below and gulls tracing white arcs above the cliffs. The driver parked and helped with my bag. I thanked him, then entered the code on the gate. The locks clicked open with a soft mechanical sigh. Inside, the house smelled faintly of oak and new paint. Marble floors stretched across the foyer, pale and smooth under the soft echo of my footsteps. Floor-to-ceiling windows faced the sea, filling the room with shifting light. The air felt still, expectant, like it was waiting to be claimed. I set my suitcase by the stairs and walked barefoot through the hall. Each step felt like exhaling something I hadn't realized I'd been holding for years. I opened the terrace doors, and the wind moved through my hair, cool and salt-sweet. Below, the waves rolled in slow and certain folding over themselves again and again. The mansion wasn't just a home, it was a full stop at the end of a sentence that had taken 30 years to write. 6 months of negotiations, lawyers, and paperwork had led to this. The offer had been made through a private acquisition firm, my name carefully hidden behind initials and trusts. The funds came directly from Lantern's buyout, wired into an account that no one, not even Rachel, could trace to me. When my lawyer called to confirm, his voice had been steady, almost reverent. "It's done," he'd said. "You're the sole owner of the Malibu property." Paid in full. I hadn't told anyone. Not my team, not the few friends who still called from time to time, and certainly not my family. Some things are too clean to share. Back in the present, I wandered through the rooms. The walls were bare, the shelves empty, but nothing felt vacant. The office had built-in bookcases, the bedroom opened to an endless view of the ocean, and in the corner of the living room stood a grand piano that came with the house. I hadn't played since I was a child. I lifted the cover and pressed one key. The sound echoed softly, low, and pure. It didn't sound like Lydia's piano, the one she used to practice on while I cleaned the kitchen. This one was quieter, honest. I pressed another key, then another. No melody, just sound, clean, unpretentious, mine. When I finally sat on the couch, the silence around me was deep but kind. It wasn't the silence I'd known in Austin, where it had weight and judgment. This was the kind that made space for breathing. I poured a glass of water and watched the horizon shift. It occurred to me then how everything I'd built, the code, the company, the walls around my name, had led to this moment. The girl who once slept beside a staircase now owned a house built on a cliff. My phone buzzed on the table. An email. The subject line read, Strategic Collaboration Opportunity. I almost deleted it, but then I saw the sender's name, Lydia Callahan. For a moment, I didn't move. Then I opened it. Dear Lantern Team, it began, I'm reaching out to explore a potential brand collaboration. As you may know, my media presence has experienced a temporary dip due to false accusations from a few misinformed clients. I'm working with advisors to rebuild and am seeking partnerships that align with wellness, financial clarity, and digital empowerment. Your platform caught my attention, and I'd love to connect with the founder directly. Warmly, Lydia. No last name in the signature. No acknowledgement of who she was writing to, as if she didn't know. I stared at the screen for a long time, then typed a short reply. Thank you for your interest. We've passed your request to the relevant department. If there's alignment, someone will be in touch. No name, no signature. After I hit send, I sat back and let the quiet stretch out. I wasn't angry, not even satisfied, just done. Later that day, my operations director flagged the same message in our internal system. You want me to respond officially or let it drop, he asked over chat. Let it drop, I typed. By Monday, her name was everywhere. A boutique fitness chain in Denver posted a statement on social media. Unpaid partnerships, unreturned emails, missed refunds. The post went viral within hours. Other companies joined in. By evening, Lydia's brand was trending for all the wrong reasons. I didn't comment. I didn't even read the full threads. I just sat outside with my laptop, the ocean air moving softly across the patio. The fire pit crackled beside me, its light flickering over the glass of my screen. Lantern's growth charts glowed steady and upward. Then 2 days later, a podcast uploaded an episode titled, The Real Founder Behind Lantern. I hadn't authorized it. The voice was mine, clipped from an old internal panel I'd recorded for onboarding. In the clip, I'd been asked what motivated me to build the company. Sometimes my voice said, when you're told enough times that you don't belong at the table, you stop asking for a seat. You build a new room instead, and you don't hang a nameplate. The host asked, have you ever been underestimated? I laughed in the audio. My own family once asked if I even knew what a spreadsheet formula was. That was the moment I started designing the engine. The episodes spread fast. Screenshots of old patents appeared online, my initials connected to every early document. Someone even found a clip from Lydia's birthday party, the one where she'd shouted, "Get out!" The comments wrote the story for me. She was the sister who built Lantern, the one who got pushed out. I didn't log in to read them all. I didn't need to. The world had finally pieced together what I'd never said. That evening, my phone rang. Unknown number. I let it go to voicemail. Then it rang again. I answered. Evelyn. Her voice trembled. I didn't say anything. Is it true, she asked, that you're the one behind Lantern? Another pause, then a quiet exhale. Why didn't you ever tell me? I tried once, I said. You laughed. I didn't mean I know. She was silent for a long time. Then she whispered, they're saying you planned this, that you wanted to destroy me. I stared out at the ocean, its surface glowing silver under the moon. I didn't plan the fall, Lydia. I just stopped cushioning it. The line went quiet. Then came the faint sound of breathing, and finally the click of the call ending. I stood there for a while, the phone still warm in my hand. Below, the tide pulled against the rocks, steady and unbothered. For years I had wanted to be seen by her, by all of them. Now they finally saw me, and it didn't matter anymore. When I went back inside, the piano waited in the corner, gleaming faintly in the dim light. I pressed one key again, soft, deliberate. The note lingered, then disappeared into the air. Some sounds don't need an audience. Outside, the horizon glowed pale against the dark. For the first time in my life, the silence didn't ask for explanation. It simply stayed, as if it finally recognized me too. The sun was just rising over the peaks when I woke up, light spreading across the Rockies in slow gold ribbons. The air inside the mansion was cold enough to see my breath, but I didn't mind. I wrapped myself in a wool sweater and padded barefoot to the terrace. From up here, the world felt endless, the slopes below covered in snow, the valley hidden under a thin veil of mist. It was the kind of silence I had imagined all my life. The kind you don't earn from peace treaties but from distance. When I bought this house, I told the realtor I wanted the view more than the rooms. People pay for luxury, he'd said. You're paying for altitude. He was right. There was something sacred about being above the noise. I made coffee in the kitchen, the machine humming softly like an obedient companion. As it brewed, I scrolled through my phone, half distracted. A news notification popped up on the screen. Lydia Callahan faces lawsuits for fraud and contract breach. The article opened with her photo hair perfectly arranged, smile polished but tight. The words beneath it were cold, unpaid vendors, false advertising investors pulling out. The same crowd that once praised her was now circling like vultures. I set the phone down and stared out the window. Snow was falling again, flakes drifting past the glass in slow motion. The world has a strange way of balancing itself. I didn't gloat. I didn't even smile. I just felt something inside me settle, a weight that had been shifting for years, finally clicking into place. For so long, Lydia had been the golden one, the center of every room. Now the spotlight she loved so much had turned on her, bright and unforgiving. Karma didn't shout, it whispered. 2 days later, my inbox flooded with articles. The birthday scandal resurfaces. Someone had posted the old video, the one from that night, when she told me to get out. The internet did what it always does. It devoured context and created its own. Comments poured in. That's her sister. No wonder she went quiet. You can hear their mom laughing. I didn't comment. I didn't need to. For years they had told their version of the story. Now the world was telling mine without even realizing it. That afternoon, my phone rang. Rachel. You've seen the news, she said. I have. Are you okay? I'm fine. She hesitated. It's poetic, isn't it? I sipped my coffee, staring at the snow swirling outside. Poetry implies beauty. This is just symmetry. She exhaled a small laugh. Same difference. After we hung up, I sat at my desk and opened my laptop. Lantern's analytics dashboard blinked to life. Numbers, rising users, climbing donations to our foundation doubling since the week before. It was all happening quietly, without any press, without any photo ops. Just light spreading from one screen to another, steady and unhurried. Later that night, another notification appeared, a live stream alert. Lydia. I hesitated before clicking. She was sitting in a studio, the lighting too bright against her pale face. The interviewer leaned forward, voice careful. There have been questions about your family, your sister, and the recent claims that she founded Lantern. Would you like to respond? Lydia's eyes glistened, mascara smudged. She took a breath and said, I've always supported my sister, even when she resented me. I didn't ask for any of this to go public. I was betrayed. I watched her blink back, tears, her voice trembling just enough to sound rehearsed. The comments section exploded in real time, half sympathy, half outrage. I closed the tab. Forgiveness wasn't in the performance, it was in the refusal to play. A few hours later, my lawyer called. Evelyn, he said, you should know the media's digging into the acquisition paperwork. Your name might surface soon. Let it. He paused. You sure? Truth doesn't need managing, it just needs time. When I hung up, I turned off the lights and stood by the window. The valley below was covered in white, glowing faintly under the moon. It looked untouched, pure, but I knew better. Snow only hides the scars beneath it. The next morning, a new wave of articles appeared. The real founder of Lantern confirmed. My old patent filings had surfaced, my initials now linked to the entire development history. Screenshots of Lydia's birthday video were everywhere, again side by side with the podcast clip where I'd said, sometimes you stop asking for a seat and build your own room. It should have felt like victory. It didn't. It felt like closure. A door closing softly, finally. Around noon, my phone rang again. Mom. I almost let it go to voicemail, but something made me answer. Evelyn, she said, voice thin, shaking slightly. Is this how you get back at us? I kept folding the sweater in my hands, slow and deliberate. I'm not getting back at anyone. You knew what that interview would do, she snapped. You let them connect the dots. I didn't start the fire, I said. I just stopped putting it out. You think you're better than us now? No, I said quietly. I just stopped mistaking silence for love. The line went dead. I stood there for a moment, phone still pressed against my ear. Then I set it down and exhaled. There was no anger left, just the ache of something that had already burned away. That night I lit a fire in the stone hearth, the room filled with the crackle of wood and the soft hiss of wind outside. I poured a glass of red wine and sat by the window. On the table beside me was the unopened birthday card Dad had sent months ago. Cheap cardstock glittery balloons, the kind sold at gas stations. Happy birthday, Eva, it said. Wrong name, wrong date. I slipped it back into the drawer. Beneath it was the deed to the mansion, my name printed clearly across the top. I touched the paper, lightly tracing the letters. Evelyn Callahan. For the first time the name felt full, not borrowed. Outside the storm picked up. Snow drifted past the windows in ribbons, turning the world white. I thought of Lydia somewhere in Los Angeles, her PR team scrambling her phone, ringing off the hook. I thought of my mother pacing the old kitchen, still trying to rewrite history in her head. And then I thought of myself, the girl who once slept beside a staircase, who built her first bridge from scrap wire, and Hope, who learned that strength isn't loud, it's persistent. I raised my glass toward the window. To silence, I whispered. The kind that finally speaks. The snow kept falling, heavy and soft. The fire burned low. Somewhere below the clouds, cities roared and screens flashed and names trended. But up here, above it all, the only sound was the steady hum of the wind and the quiet beating of my own heart. I leaned back in the chair, closed my eyes, and let the warmth sink in. No headlines, no applause, just stillness. It was enough. Snow still clung to the branches outside my window when the story broke. I was halfway through a cup of coffee, wrapped in an old cardigan, when my phone began vibrating across the counter, one alert after another. At first I ignored them, but when the same headline repeated again and again, I opened one. Influencer and wellness coach Lydia Callahan faces accusations of financial misconduct. Her photo filled the screen, smiling flawless, but the eyes gave her away. Beneath it were the words lawsuits, unpaid contracts, breach of trust. The same audience that once cheered her on was now tearing her apart, one comment at a time. I scrolled through the feed, the rhythm of it almost hypnotic. People loved a downfall, especially when it was wrapped in glitter. Outside, the sun was beginning to melt the snow, dripping from the gutters in steady lines. I set my cup down and watched the water slide down the glass. The world always balances itself. It just takes time. The following week, the story spread everywhere. Videos, gossip columns, reaction clips. Some of her old interviews resurfaced, Lydia talking about authentic living and trusting your intuition. Now those same lines were being played under captions calling her a fraud. The same hands that once clapped for her were pointing fingers. Then came the video. Someone uploaded a clip from her 30th birthday, the one she told me to get out of. The footage was grainy, taken from a guest's phone. You could see her in that white dress standing at the head of the table, glass in hand. Then, her voice sharp and clear, "Get out." The camera shifted just enough to catch me in the background, frozen silent, holding my coat. Mom laughing softly, Dad smirking, Lydia glowing in the center. The clip spread fast. People dissected it frame by frame like a crime scene. That's her sister. So she was humiliated on camera. No wonder she disappeared. I didn't comment. I didn't need to. The internet has its own form of justice it never forgets. Rachel called that night. "You've seen the chaos," she said. "I have. You're quiet about it. What's there to say? Karma's more patient than people." She let out a slow breath. "You're not wrong. The next morning I woke to another call. Mom. I almost didn't answer, but old habits die hard. Your sister's life is falling apart, she began, her voice tight, trembling with the strain of control. You could help her. Say something nice publicly. You have influence now. I stared out at the snow-covered valley. I said something nice once, I replied softly. No one listened. This isn't the time for pride, she snapped. It's not pride, I said. It's peace. Silence filled the line, heavy and uneven. Then she exhaled, quick and angry. You sound just like your father when he's disappointed. Maybe he should have taught me what compassion looked like. Click. She hung up. For a long time, I stood in the quiet house, the phone still warm in my hand. I wasn't angry. I wasn't sad. Just still. That afternoon, I went for a walk down the mountain trail behind the house. The air was thin and sharp, filled with the faint scent of pine. My boots sank into the snow with each step. Somewhere below, the world was spinning in its usual chaos, lawsuits, scandals, headlines, but up here, it was just sky and silence. When I got back, a voicemail waited. Lydia's voice. You saw it, didn't you? She said, words trembling. You think I deserve this. I know you do. But I didn't mean for things to go that far. She paused, breathing uneven. You were always stronger than me. I hated you for that. But please, don't let them destroy me. I listened once, then deleted it. The next morning she was on television. A live interview, soft lighting, sympathetic host, everything staged to make her look small and broken. I didn't plan to watch, but it played automatically on a news channel. Lydia sat on a beige couch, hands clasped tight. The host leaned forward. There's been talk about your family, about your sister, the founder of Lantern. Lydia looked down. I've always loved my sister, she said, voice trembling perfectly. Even when she resented me, I never turned my back on her, her mascara smudged at the corner of her eye. I didn't ask for this to go public. I was betrayed. I turned off the TV. The words didn't sting, they just echoed hollow like a song she'd memorized, but never understood. A few hours later, my lawyer called. You should know, he said carefully, the press has connected the Lantern acquisition to you. They're requesting comment. Don't give one, I said. You're sure? Yes. Let the noise devour itself. For years I had lived beneath their narrative, Lydia's star, mom's pride, dad's rules. Now the story was collapsing under its own weight. It didn't need my push. That night I sat by the fire, wine glass in hand. The flames licked the edges of the logs, soft and steady. Across the room, the piano gleamed faintly in the light. I pressed one note, then another. No melody, just rhythm. The sound filled the space like something breathing. I remembered Lydia's voice from that night in Austin, the way she'd said, "Get out," like it was a curse. Now it felt more like a release. A new headline flashed on my phone. Lantern Foundation expands grant program for women in STEM. I smiled faintly. That was Rachel's doing. While the world tore itself apart over family drama, our work went quietly on, real steady, alive. I set the phone aside and looked out the window. Snow was falling again, soft and deliberate. The next morning I woke to sunlight glinting off the peaks. My inbox was full of congratulations from colleagues, investors thrilled with Lantern's latest milestones. In the corner of the screen, a small news notification appeared. 2 of Lydia Callahan's major sponsors withdraw contracts following public backlash. I closed my laptop and poured another cup of coffee. I didn't feel triumph or pity, just clarity. Some lessons can't be taught, they have to unfold. Later that evening, I built a fire outside in the pit overlooking the valley. The flames flickered in the cold air, the smoke curling upward. I raised my glass toward the sky. To gravity, I murmured, for doing what I couldn't. The snow started falling again, slow and soundless, blanketing the edges of the fire pit, melting as it landed on the heat. I watched it for a long time until my fingertips were numb, and the light from the house behind me glowed faintly gold against the dark. Karma, I thought, wasn't loud. It didn't arrive with thunder or revenge. It just waited quiet and sure until the scales balanced themselves. By the time I went back inside, the fire had burned down to embers. The house was still and warm. I closed the door behind me, the wind catching for a moment before fading. No more noise, no more ghosts, just the steady heartbeat of silence filling the world exactly the way it should. The snow was melting, slowly dripping from the edge of the roof in patient rhythm. I stood by the window, coffee in hand, watching the thin trails of water snake down the glass. Spring was late this year in Colorado, reluctant to arrive, but the mountains had begun to show their bones again, dark ridges cutting through white. The house was quiet, except for the wind moving across the pines. That was when I noticed the envelope in the mailbox. It was thick, cream-colored, the kind of stationery people used when they still believed apologies looked better on expensive paper. My name was written across the front in handwriting I hadn't seen in years. Slightly leaning to the right, loops rushed like the words couldn't wait to get away from their writer. My mother's. I carried it inside but didn't open it. I set it on the counter beside my cup and stared at it while the coffee cooled. I had learned the hard way that silence sometimes says everything a letter can't. The envelope stayed there all morning while I cleaned the kitchen, answered emails, checked in with Rachel about new grant applications. Every time I passed it, I felt it watching me. By noon, I gave in. I slid my finger under the flap and unfolded 5 pages of blue ink, written in her familiar, elegant hand. The first line started with a story I'd already heard too many times. We did our best, Evelyn. Things were never easy. I read it all in one sitting. She wrote about the early years, money-tight opportunities, missed Lydia needing special attention. She was always fragile, my mother wrote. You were strong, independent. You never needed much from us. There it was again, that word. Independent. The family's polite way of saying invisible. She mentioned the news, of course. The scandal. The interviews. How hurtful it had been to see our family name dragged through the mud. How confused they all were by my silence. You could have reached out, she said. We would have stood by you if you had only asked. I put the letter down halfway through the 3rd page. The words blurred for a moment. I wasn't angry, just tired. The rhythm of her voice hadn't changed. It was the same tone she used when she told me to give Lydia my slice of cake because you're older, you understand. The letter ended with a plea. Maybe it's time to rebuild. The house feels emptier now. I hope you can look past everything and see the bigger picture. The bigger picture. I almost laughed. The one where my face was always cropped out. I folded the letter neatly and set it back on the table. The edges trembled slightly in the sunlight. Then I noticed a smaller envelope tucked between the pages, sealed with a smudge of black ink. My father's handwriting, this time stiffer, uneven. I hesitated before opening it. Inside was a birthday card, the kind sold in gas stations. Glitter balloons on the front, a generic message printed inside, hope. Your day is filled with love. Beneath it, he'd scrawled, Happy birthday, Eva. Eva. Not Evelyn. Not even the right day. I smiled, small and tired. It wasn't anger I felt or even hurt, just confirmation of what I already knew. He had never really known me. Maybe he never wanted to. I placed both letters on the counter side by side and watched the sunlight creep across them. Then I made a choice. I didn't rip them up. I didn't frame them. I just slid them into the bottom drawer of my desk, the same one that held the lantern patent papers and an old photo of me at 16 grease on my hands, holding a soldering iron at a robotics fair. In that picture I was grinning pure, unfiltered joy. The kind that didn't need witnesses. After that, I grabbed my coat and stepped outside. The air smelled of thawing earth and pine. I followed the narrow trail behind the house that wound up toward the ridge. The ground was soft beneath my boots, patches of grass breaking through the snow. Halfway up, I stopped and looked down at the valley. The house was small from this height, a pale square against the vastness of white and green. For years, I'd dreamed of climbing above everything that hurt me, and now here I was higher than the noise, higher than their expectations. I sat on a rock, letting the wind push my hair across my face. For a while, I just listened. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was full of things I finally understood. When I was little, I used to wait for my mother's voice calling me in for dinner. Even after the sun set, I'd sit on the back steps watching the kitchen window, waiting for that flicker of light. Sometimes it came. Most times it didn't. Eventually, I learned to make my own dinner, to call myself in. Forgiveness, I realized, was not about giving anyone permission. It was about reclaiming time that no longer deserved to be wasted. When I got back to the house, the air had warmed. Meltwater trickled down the slope, tiny streams gathering in the driveway. I brewed a fresh cup of coffee, sat at my desk, and pulled out a blank sheet of stationery. Not the fancy kind, just plain cream paper. I wrote only a few lines. There are things that once thrown away cannot be folded back into place. But I'm okay. I hope you are too. Then, under my name, I added a single line: Evelyn Callahan, owner, 12000 feet above sea level. I didn't sign it with love. I didn't apologize. I didn't accuse. It wasn't a letter to reopen anything. It was a letter to mark an ending. I set it aside without sealing it. Some words only need to exist once. Outside, the last of the snow began to fall in slow, thin flakes, melting before they hit the ground. I opened the window and let the air drift in. The scent of pine, the faint hiss of melting ice, it all felt like a kind of baptism. The phone buzzed on the desk. A text from Rachel. New funding round approved. We did it. I smiled and typed back, we always do. Then I looked again at the unsent letter. The graphite from my pencil glinted under the lamp. I folded it once, placed it in an envelope, and wrote my mother's address on the front. The next morning, I drove into town. The post office was nearly empty. The clerk smiled when I handed him the letter. Tracking? He asked. I shook my head. No, some things don't need to be traced. When I got home, the sky had cleared. The peaks shone bright against the blue. I opened all the windows, letting sunlight fill the rooms. The house didn't feel empty anymore. It felt honest. Later that afternoon, as I sat on the deck with my coffee, a new alert popped up on my phone. Lydia had taken down her social media profiles. Her company's website was gone. The silence on the internet felt louder than any scandal. I didn't feel triumph, just stillness. For the first time in years, I wasn't waiting for anyone to say my name. I wasn't waiting for permission to rest. The mountains stretched endlessly before me, solid and quiet, their ridges catching the light like old scars. I raised my cup toward them and whispered I made it. Then I closed my eyes and let the wind carry the rest away. The morning light slipped quietly across the peaks, pale gold spilling over the snowcaps and down into the valley. The world outside my window looked washed clean, the last traces of winter retreating under the warmth of spring. I sat on the deck, wrapped in a shawl, coffee steaming between my hands. The house was still peaceful in the way only a home built from silence could be. For the first time, I didn't wake up thinking about who might be watching or who might not. The mountains didn't care who had won or lost. They just stood there, patient, ancient, unmoved. Inside, Tess was already awake, papers spread across the dining table, glasses sliding down her nose. She looked up when I came in. Morning, she said, her voice still rough from sleep. Morning, I replied, setting my cup beside her. The table was full of folders, forms, and printed photos. Each one carried the face of a girl, some shy, some fierce, some smiling as if they were learning how. Tess tapped the top of the stack. They're ready, she said. The first recipients of your scholarship. You should be proud. I sat down beside her, scanning the names. Amira, Joe, Kelsey. Faces that reminded me of different versions of myself. The ones who were told they didn't fit, who had been called too quiet, too serious, too much. They look strong, I said softly. They are, Tess said. They just needed someone to see it. I reached for one of the letters, handwritten in careful print. Dear Miss Callahan, thank you for giving me a chance. I've never had anyone believe in me before. I hope one day I can do the same for someone else. I blinked, feeling the words settle in my chest like something warm and steady. You think they'll make it? Tess smiled. If they have half your stubbornness, they'll be unstoppable. She packed up her papers, closing each folder with deliberate care. It's funny, she said. You named it after the room nobody wanted. I nodded. The one beside the staircase. The left of the stairwell fund, she said, shaking her head. Perfect. That room made me, I said. It taught me to build in the dark. Tess chuckled softly. And now you're lighting the path for others. When she left later that morning, the house fell quiet again. I lingered at the window, watching her car disappear down the long, winding road until it was swallowed by the trees. Then I walked to the small room beside the staircase, the one that now held more light than any other place in the house. The studio smelled faintly of cedar and paint. White walls, bookshelves, lined with notebooks, 2 large windows framing the endless sky. On the desk sat the manuscript I had been writing for months, building from silence. A book, maybe, or a letter to every woman who had ever been told she was too quiet to matter. I flipped open the cover and ran my fingers over the first page. We are the daughters of Echo, I had written. We are the sound that never needed permission to exist. I smiled. A small ping broke the silence, a new email. I glanced at my screen. The sender's name made my breath catch for half a second. Julian Cross. The message was short. I haven't earned the right to say much, but I meant it when I said you were the best partner I ever had. I was too cowardly to admit it then. I hope you're doing well. I read it twice, then hit delete. Not out of anger, just peace. Some apologies are better left in the past. By late afternoon, the clouds began to move in gray shadows sweeping across the mountains. I lit the fire in the living room and poured a glass of wine. The light from the flames danced over the piano keys, the ones I had learned to touch without needing a song. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the faint scent of rain. The mail came just before sunset. Among the bills and flyers was a single envelope embossed with the crest of Carnegie Mellon University. I tore it open and unfolded the letter. They were inviting me to speak, to share my story with students in the engineering program. For a long moment, I just stared at the page. Then I walked upstairs into my office and placed it next to a framed photo of 16-year-old me at the robotics competition. My hands were covered in oil, my smile wide and certain. That girl had wanted so badly to be seen. Maybe now she finally was. The next morning, I woke early, long before sunrise. I stepped out onto the terrace, the air crisp and alive. Below, the valley shimmered under a low fog, and from the town far below, a faint glow began to rise. Lanterns, hundreds of them, floating upward like fireflies. They must have been celebrating the spring festival. From this height, they looked like stars escaping gravity, carrying prayers and promises into the sky. I leaned on the railing, watching them drift higher and higher until they scattered into the clouds. For years I whispered I wanted to be seen. Now I just want to shine for the ones still finding their way. Inside the house, lights were warm, soft, steady, tiny reflections of the lanterns outside. Every room glowed with quiet life. The mansion that once felt like a fortress now felt like a beacon. That night, Tess called. The news outlets are asking for a statement, she said. You want to comment? No, I said, smiling faintly. Let them talk. I've already said everything I needed to. What's next for you? Then I looked around the room, the walls, the books, the view, beyond the glass. Maybe I'll keep building, I said, just differently this time. When we hung up, I walked back to the deck. The fire pit still held a few glowing embers. The wind moved softly across the ridge, carrying the faint sound of the river below. For a long while, I just stood there, breathing in the night. Everything had changed, yet everything was exactly where it should be. I thought of Lydia, of my parents, of all the versions of me that had come before the child beside the staircase, the woman at the keyboard, the voice that finally found its echo. Then I whispered into the dark, "Thank you." Not to them, but to the silence that had shaped me. The stars shimmered above the mountains, calm and infinite. If you've ever been the quiet one in your own family, if you've ever been told to stay small or step aside, tell me, what would you build if no one was watching? Would you go back and knock on that same door, or would you build something new? Entirely, I'd love to hear your story. And if you found even a small part of yourself in mine, stay a while. There are more stories like this waiting, stories about women who turned silence into strength and strength into peace. Because sometimes the quietest voices carry the furthest.